Can I please have your attention? My name is John Azarias, and for those who don't know me, I am the chair of the Executive Board of Greek Australian Business Leaders. I would like to ask the Minister Rob Stokes to join us and welcome everybody. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, all distinguished guests, one and all, to join us at this delightful panel discussion about the links between Greece and Australia in terms of the architecture of this city and its place in New South Wales. It's my pleasant task to welcome you all today to the New South Wales Parliament on behalf of John Azarias, as well as the Executive Board of the Greek Australian Business Leaders, who quite appropriately are the group that is commissioning today's discussion. It's also customary and appropriate that I acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Gadigal clan, to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect and acknowledgement to Aboriginal and First Nations people who are with us today. By way of brief introduction, as a student myself of urban planning, we owe it to the ancient Greeks, in fact, I suppose, the art of urban planning. It was Hippodamus of Miletus who is credited as being the first identified urban planner with his grid layout for the port of Piraeus and Miletus as well, and that same sort of network, geometric network of grids that you can see in the Macquarie towns of places like Richmond or Windsor or Pitt Town, some of the very earliest post-colonisation settlements of Australia, where you see the echoes of the grid plan of Hippodamus, and this hippodamian planning you can see in global cities right around the world. But more than this, Hippodamus also noted that city planning was more than just about the fabric of the streetscape itself. It was about creating a shared space, a context where people could communicate, whether that be to exchange goods, services or ideas, and to build a civilization. So we have a great deal to be grateful for in terms of the echoes of ancient Greek civilization in contemporary urban planning. But more than that, there have been so many delightful touches between Greece and Australia in relation to the shape of this city and its architecture. Certainly with John Azarias here, it would be inopportune for me not to mention the role that he has had in relation to the restoration of the Lysicrates monument in the Botanic Gardens. And it was, as John likes to say, he was on a cheap date with his wonderful wife, Dr. Patricia Azarias, when they noted this crumbling monument, and that sparked not only the restoration of the monument, but a delightful connection between architecture, between playwriting and between democracy, which is just one of these wonderful little segues where echoes of ancient times can combine with modernity to create something quite unique in Sydney here in New South Wales. So back to John, and who will introduce our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And it would be fair to say that Minister Stokes has been a co-founder of the Lysicrates Foundation with Patricia and me, because when Patricia had the idea of not only restoring the monument, but then also restoring the play competition that the monument celebrated, the Minister for the Environment at the time was certain Rob Stokes, and we went and saw him, and he was as supportive and enthusiastic of the idea as Patricia and I were. So thank you very much, Minister. Consul General of Greece, Yannis Malikourtis, members of the board of the Executive Board of Greek Australian Business Leaders, George Konfos and Nick Andriotakis, secretary of the Lysistrata Foundation, Michael Diamond, friends, dear friends, I've entitled my brief comments, The Classical Greek Achievement, an Australian Perspective. After 20 months of absence, for the reason we know all too well, it's a great pleasure for the Executive Board of Greek Australian Business Leaders to be hosting this afternoon's gathering. In 2017, the late, great Emily Matters published, and I want to show it to you because I have it here, published this book, which is a remarkable book, I think, published this book. It's an Australian, the first ever Australian textbook teaching classical Greek to young Australians. She called it Eureka, as you see. The book is magnificent, a true gift to this country. It is also completely original. In Eureka, Emily does something that's very Greek. She pays her respects to the indigenous foundational myths and highlights the deeply human similarities between them and the foundational myths of the Greeks of the classical era. It is a tipping of the hat to the very ancient indigenous cultures of this land by a distinguished white Australian classicist of Russian Jewish origin. How very Australian, how very Greek. This afternoon, our three distinguished speakers will talk about the reception of classical Greek ideas in Australia, Europe, and worldwide. Alastair will be discussing how Greek ideas were received in Europe and globally, touching on architecture. Philip and Angelo will specifically consider the reception of these ideas in Australia, and both of them will be focusing on the built environment. In any act of reception, there is the receiver, but there is also the giver, the source. I will focus my brief comments here on the giver and set the scene from the giver's point of view, that is, from the point of view of classical Greek. I will be dividing my comments into two parts. In the first part, I will try to examine what the fundamental feature of the Greek achievement was, in other words, what the real essence was of the intellectual leap that the Greeks made in the 5th century BCE. In the second part, I will seek to explain why the classical Greek achievement has been so willingly embraced and absorbed by an immense variety of cultures over many centuries. First, the basic characteristic of the Greek achievement. Well before the Greeks, the peoples of Mesopotamia and Egypt had developed outstanding inventions and contributions to knowledge in a number of areas. Those contributions were later refined in the Levant. We know that the Greeks were definitely not the original inventors. So what was so new, so noteworthy about the Greek contribution? What the Greeks did was to take these inventions and develop conceptual frameworks around them, ways of looking at and working with them. There are different words for what they were the first to introduce. Systems, critical analysis, structures, principles, theories, definitions, categories, methods, introspection. The Greeks created the scientific method, grammatical categories, political theory, and philosophical and aesthetic principles. It is no accident that most of these words are Greek. In other words, they were the first to create a governance, a discipline, an order around these various fields of thought and action, which had been discovered well before them. Governance lies at the root of most human endeavors. Doing it well is very hard and requires high levels of imagination, intellectual effort, and diplomacy. Good governance systems enable predictability. They reduce confusion, waste, and disorder. They make connections, draw inferences, facilitate analysis. As a result, they speed up progress. That quantum or meta leap into governance was the essence of the Greek achievement. What made it even more impressive was that they combined this conceptualization with a specifically Greek characteristic, namely litotes, the ability to express complex ideas in a pithy way. The Greeks loved litotes. They still do. Anyone who mastered it, rhetoricians, generals, playwrights, was admired and quoted. The consummate exponent of litotes was Sappho, the great poet from Lesbos, considered by the Greeks to be the greatest poet of all. So the Greeks' introduction of conceptualization, structure, and method, together with their love of succinctness, of going to the essence of things, created a very seminal moment in human history, because ever since, that approach has shaped the way humankind has looked at not just scientific disciplines, but social activities. It catapulted the Greeks from being simple seafarers and peasants to the level of philosophers and theoreticians whose influence on the Western mind has been incalculable. Edith Hall's subtitle in a recent book she wrote on the ancient Greeks put it very elegantly. Ancient Greeks, quote, from Bronze Age seafarers to navigators of the Western mind, unquote. I would very much agree, but at the same time, I would submit that as we look at the influence of 5th century Greece, we go beyond the Western mind to a global level. As William McNeill has put it in his magisterial work, The Rise of the West, the global mind has been shaped by Western concepts and categories, which effectively means by classical Greek concepts. Countless receiving cultures and nations over the whole world have been willing, often eager, to espouse and absorb these Greek models. Apart from admiration for the brilliance of that Greek achievement and the intellectual leap it entailed, there was another reason for all that global enthusiasm. And this leads me to the second point I want to stress. That is, that Greek high culture was not racially based. As the 5th and 4th century BCE rhetorician Isocrates said, I quote, "The name Greek seems no longer to belong to a race, but to a way of thinking. And those who share our education and culture are called Greeks," and that's the most important point here, "more than those who share our blood," unquote. A remarkable approach. So this was a culture which did not look at bloodlines, which rejected tribalism, and which valued only an adherence to a system of thought based around concepts like equality before the law, like a love of examining and reflecting and critically analyzing. This all-embracing, very human approach can be seen time and time again in Greek literature over millennia, starting with Homer. You will remember Homer's compassionate depictions of Hector and his little family on the eve of the battle that would see Hector slain, and of Hector's old father Priam as he comes to Achilles to beg for his son's body. Now, please bear in mind that the Trojans were the enemy. Can you imagine in the Great War, the British or the French or the Germans speaking compassionately about each other and about their humanities? This is the leap of imagination and humanity that Homer did to depict the enemy as human as your own side. You will have read the fascinated, empathetic account of Herodotus, of the peoples he discovers on his travels, and his deep respect and indeed affection for the then hereditary enemy of the Greeks, the Persians. Herodotus loved the Persians. Herodotus admired the Persians and their civilization. And many of you know the work of my favorite poet and fellow Alexandrian, Cavafy, who makes no distinction among races or peoples, but rather speaks to a profound universal humanity. Of course, foreigners were attracted by such a non-racialist, non-tribal approach and were eager to adopt it. So it was this high thinking and pithiness, this litotes, combined with a generosity and openness of spirit, which throughout the millennia captured the imagination and the adherence of countless generations of non-Greeks. These Greek factors, order and method in analysis and action, including creative life, generosity and openness of spirit to other cultures, and rejection of bombast and magniloquence, found a welcoming home in Australia, as the Minister so aptly said earlier. Not just in architecture, although this afternoon we will be hearing about the Greek influence in our built environment, but also in very many aspects of our political, social, and intellectual life. And the influence of those factors started very early in the history of this country. We need look no further than our own James Martin, a poor Irish boy, the son of an Irish servant. Martin grew up in Parramatta and Sydney. He never visited Greek-speaking lands. I doubt that he had ever met any native Greek speakers in his life, and yet he was imbued by these Greek ideas. He built the Sydney sandstone replica that the Minister mentioned earlier of the Lysikrates monument that we have in the Botanic Garden. He was a true Philhellene, and it was these ideas that allowed him to reach his potential. And by the way, our present Chief Justice, the Honourable Andrew Bell, CJ18, I call him CJ18 because he's our 18th Chief Justice. Martin was CJ4, titled his recent address for the 2022 Martin Oration, quote, "On classic ground, Martin's Lysikrates monument and civilizational yearnings in colonial New South Wales." You can find a copy of this brilliant oration on our website, by the way, the Lysikrates Foundation website. The inscriptions on the two identical statues of Martin in Martin Place and Parramatta Square, statues which, by the way, show him holding a book of Homer, both mention that James Martin was a Philhellene, which he would consider the highest praise of all. And it's a fair bet that if Martin were alive today, he would love the spirit of Emily Matter's extraordinary little textbook, Eureka, and would be delighted that 10,000 miles away and 25 centuries later, young Australians too are studying the brilliance and all-embracing character of the classical Greek achievements, and we very much hope learning to become Philhellenes. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Alastair, who will, Blanshard, who will, Professor Paul Eliadis, Professor of Classics at Queensland University. Over to you, Alastair.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, was mentioned I'm just down from Brisbane, where I live and work on the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and I'd like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. It's a great pleasure to be back in Sydney, a place which I have deep affection for. I was here at the University of Sydney for about 10 years, so it's great to be back. And today my job is really to give you a sense of how the classical architecture of Sydney fits in within a sort of wider international context, to give you a sense of how the local that will be discussed in detail by Philip and Angelo is also important internationally. And so I want to begin my talk with the 1750s. In the fashionable salons of London and Paris, where talk was abuzz, that the news was emerging of a fabulous ancient city that had been discovered in the deserts of Syria, a whole grand metropolis unknown to the West. That city, of course, was Palmyra, that extraordinary capital on the Silk Route, cosmopolitan Greek-speaking community where travellers from Persia, Mesopotamia and India mixed with Greeks and Romans in the shelter of the wadi by the cool, refreshing waters of the oasis. A city that had stood for thousands of years as a testament to the civilizing power of multicultural life, until its sad destruction by ISIS in 2015, a loss that many of us are still feeling quite strongly. Palmyra's rediscovery, a slight misnomer, as of course the local Syrian population had never, in fact, ever lost sight of it, but its rediscovery here imagined rather kind of romantically by Robert Wood and his companions generated huge excitement. His publication of the ruins became an international bestseller. It offered, for the first time, this tantalizing possibility that there might be equally unknown remains lurking in Ottoman lands. It energized whole groups such as the Society of Dilettanti, which had previously been largely a drinking group of aristocratic reprobates keen on booze and squalid sexual liaisons, to turn their attention to archaeology, which is sort of like booze and sexual liaisons. And they decided to sponsor, in fact, a whole series of expeditions to go out and have a look. I should say that they didn't give up the drinking. This isn't a sort of redemption story whereby Greek architecture turns your life around. Rather, they just add archaeology into the mix. But they sponsored people like Stuart and Rivette to go out and detail the antiquities that remained in Athens, people like Richard Chandler to go out and undertake expeditions to the coast of Asia Minor to detail what they found there. And this resulted in a whole slew, as you can see, of publications that detailed countless buildings, monuments, and inscriptions. Western Europe was reintroduced to the Parthenon, here captured in Stuart and Rivette's engraving, which shows the Acropolis as it was previously very heavily inhabited. In the middle, you can see the mosque, the Parthenon being unique almost in having been both a pagan temple, a Christian church, and a mosque, each great religious movement finding, in some sense, delight in the architectural form. The attention to detail in their records was extraordinary, and it meant for the first time that Greek architecture was able to be studied and appreciated with a kind of seriousness and a depth that hadn't previously been possible. And people responded to this Greek architecture with enthusiasm and alacrity. People couldn't get enough of works like this, for example, the Temple of Dionysus at Chios, which quickly became the paradigm of what an Ionic order temple, Greek temple, should look like. But people just didn't study it. They also recreated it and copied it. So, for example, take someone like Francis Dashwood here, the Baron of Despencer, when he wasn't scandalising London dressed as a monk and holding his kind of wild sex parties at his newly founded Hellfire Club. he was embarking on a major restoration of his house, West Wickham Park, to which he added a portico that was directly modelled on the temple of Dionysus at Chios, which he himself, the expedition which he had funded. Now, this turn towards specifically Greek architecture came at a crucial time in the history of Europe. Greek architecture had found its moment, and that moment was revolution. These days, I think neoclassical architecture is often unfairly maligned as kind of old-fashioned and conservative. Nothing could be further from the truth. When it emerged again in the 18th century, it wasn't seen as some sort of kind of throwback to a conservative past. Instead, it was seen as the new form of architecture that spoke to the new values of the age, right? This was the age of revolutions, the French, the American, the Haitian, and of course I always kind of classify it as the sort of delayed Enlightenment revolution, the Greek Revolution of 1821. This was a world crying out for new architectural forms that weren't associated with kings and monarchs, that weren't about tyrants and subjects. It was about an architecture for a republic of citizens in which the relationship between the individual and the state was being radically and completely rethought. So the new really discovered Greek architecture offered an architectural language and form that was democratic in its sensibility, that embodied the principles and values of the Enlightenment, and was transnational and cosmopolitan in character. And what I want to do is kind of take each of these values in turn. Now, the first is democratic. From the very beginning, it was an architectural form that has been associated with kind of the restraint of absolute power and democratic, republican, and parliamentary forms of government. It's no accident, for example, that Ireland, when it sought to house its newly embodied parliament, for example, sought an architectural form that spoke to the new age. So Edward Lovett Pearce, already a fan of classical form through his love of Palladio, worked in a particularly Greek style for his 18th century Irish parliament, a building whose porticos would have tremendous impact, not least on other parliamentary architecture. John spoke about the Greek genius lying in governance, and there's perhaps no better example of this than the way in which that democratic governments have embraced classical architecture. From Colombia, for example, here the presidential palace, once the home of one of the fathers of Colombian independence, Antonio Ibarres, to Indonesia's Bogor Palace, classical architecture has been seen as providing a fitting home for the leaders of parliamentary systems. Greek architecture is a way of indicating power and authority without ideas of kingship. And of course, the best example is the US, which turns to the neoclassical in terms of its constant desires to embody itself. I mean, Washington is dotted with neoclassical buildings, but perhaps to my mind the most interesting one is, of course, the Lincoln Memorial, where not only is the architectural form Greek, but the interior is influenced by the Greek as well. Here we can see Daniel Chester French's very famous statue of Lincoln, a statue that is specifically, and he acknowledges this, modelled on Quatremère de Cassis' recreation of Phidias's statue of Olympian Zeus, one of the great seven wonders of the ancient world. So Lincoln reimagined as one of the Greek wonders of the ancient world. And it's not just governmental buildings that looked to the Greek. There's a strong association between architectural forms and the administration of justice. Whether it's Montpellier, New York, or Valletta, the classical form and the administration of justice go together. And again, we see this climaxing in the US with something like the US Supreme Court. And it was these associations with Enlightenment values of progress, newness, and democracy, as well as principles of balance and proportion, that made Greek architecture such an obvious form to build, for example, the new palaces of culture, things like, for example, the Modern Museum. And again, certain influential paradigms stick out, central to any story about how the classical and neoclassical and the museum go together must be something like, for example, Robert Smirke's British Museum. And it's indeed hard to imagine someone who was a more passionate Philhellene than Smirke. Here here's his description of his trip to Athens. This is the architect of the British Museum. How can I, by description, give you an idea of the great pleasure I enjoyed in the sight of these ancient buildings of Athens? How strongly were exemplified in them the grandeur and the effect of simplicity in architecture. The Temple of Theseus, the building we now identify as the Hephaestion, cannot but arrest the attention of everyone from its appropriate and dignified solemnity of appearance. The Temple of Minerva, i.e. the Parthenon, strikes one in the same way with its grandeur and majesty. They will always serve as a memorandum to me of what I think should always be a model. So, Smirke both kind of exemplifies a trend and solidifies it. So much so that the Greek portico has almost become a kind of cliche of museum and art gallery architecture. And again, examples taken throughout the world. And I've been trying to be deliberately international because that brings me to my final point about architecture, which is that it's cosmopolitan. The thing about Greek architecture was that it was an architectural tradition that stood out from and apart from national traditions, right? It wasn't French, Spanish, Russian, German, or British, right? It wasn't owned by any one of the great powers. Instead, it was kind of held in common by all. And John gave a wonderful quote from Isocrates about being not bonded by blood, but by culture and education. And I think it's the same idea at play here. We used to talk about a republic of letters, the world of corresponding intellectuals that stood above petty national rivalries and allowed the free flow of information and ideas. In a sense, there's a kind of republic of columns as well, a kind of cosmopolitan, transnational aesthetic. So whether it's Guadalajara, whether it's Helsinki, whether it's St. Petersburg, whether it's Mumbai, whether it's Singapore, right? We see the same shade of commitments to Enlightenment values and modernity. Now, I've spoken a lot about architectural forms, but I think the other thing that we want to stress on our panel is that the influence of Greece is more than just an adherence to forms. It's an aesthetic sensibility, but it's also a spirit. And it seems to me that if we were looking for a lesson today about what the modern city could learn from the ancient, it's the way that spirit animates the city. In particular, the way in which Greek public buildings, both great and small, provide a place for citizens to gather and congregate. Some of you may have visited an exhibition on the Greeks from the British Museum that was hosted by the National Museum in Canberra last year. Among the many treasures that came out was this one, and this was, I think, probably my favourite vase in the whole exhibition. It shows a group of women gathered at the fountain house to gather water. And what I love about this image is the way in which the artist has tried to capture the hubbub of conversation that would have attended this activity. So in Greek art, when a character is speaking, what you normally have is a kind of cascade of letters coming out of their mouth, a bit like a sort of speech bubble you see in a comic book. But here, what the artist has done is filled all the lines, the space between these characters with individual letter forms. So he's, as it were, filled the air with the language that what these women are saying. And you can't make out any individual words, all you can do is make out sounds. It's a visual representation of the lively hubbub of conversation that must have attended the meeting of women as they come together to gather water. Because the Greeks realized that cities need places for people to gather together, to share resources, to converse, to interact, to come together as a community. At the heart of every Greek city was the agora, the marketplace, the open space, the place where people come together to talk, to philosophy, to do philosophy, to do politics. And it's this idea of the open space where people come together that seems to me to be captured in things and gestures, like, for example, Francis Greenaway's fabulous fountain houses that were designed for Sydney. You can see a detail of it, one there, and then this one here, now sadly demolished. But what I'm not suggesting is that we should kind of abandon indoor plumbing and return to collecting water from fountain houses. But it does seem to me that in that idea of encouraging spaces for the sharing of resources, the exchange of ideas, or even just enjoying the pleasing sounds of running waters, that we capture something of the Greek city in its spirit, whether it's the oases of Palmyra or the neoclassical delights of the Archibald Fountain. We have these extraordinary insight, it seems to me, about communal living and what makes communal living worthwhile that was theorized by the Greeks and still influence us today. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alastair. And I want to thank Alastair for coming. Oh, the Speaker of the House has just joined us. Thank you. And I want to thank Professor Blanshard for coming all the way from Brisbane here. And Patricia, or I don't remember, mentioned that James Martin, his father, was a servant. He was the horse groom of the then Governor of New South Wales in 1820, Thomas Brisbane. So Thomas Brisbane did two things in Australia, two major contributions. The city of Brisbane was named after him, and then he brought out the family of John and Mary Martin and of their infant baby, James Martin. So it gives me great pleasure now in introducing Philip Thalis, Professor Thalis, who was on the City of Sydney Council for a number of years, and thank you for being with us. Thank you. Thank you.
Give me 1 minute.
Angelo,
Thank you very much, John. And thank you also to the dignitaries, Minister Stokes, and of course, like Alastair, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of Sydney, because it is a story about their dispossession as well. But I want to focus more on the positives here. And like Alastair, I've organised it with some themes, but quite different themes which speak to the physical reality of the city and the architectural qualities of the city. But John did warn you that we would talk more about architecture, and I love this quote by Kenneth Clark, who had said, if I had to say who should tell the truth about society, I should believe the building. Mm-hmm. And probably a particularly relevant quote in this building. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the geography of the city, because I think very much as Alastair said, Athens in the turn of 1800 was very much a bucolic city. It was awaiting the liberation with the revolution that started in 1821, but in fact only really liberated Athens from 1830. And so it was a city, it was very much an encampment, an Ottoman encampment within the armature of the classical city. Sydney also was quite a bucolic scene at exactly the same time. Obviously the point of invasion was Circular Quay, just down the street here, and you see the quite disorganised scene, which was early Sydney, often claimed to be unplanned. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's for another day. And of course, the British, like the Greeks, were in fact great colonisers. The Greeks, in fact, dotted their cities around the Mediterranean, and in fact, as far as the Black Sea, this is Selenote, and they brought their, exactly as our speakers have heard, their elements of culture to bear on the landscape. And they brought them as sort of objects in space, and something we talked together with Angelo. And of course, they brought their architecture as the symbol of the city. And I'm sorry, my notes are actually below. So you're going to miss, I'll have to read out the references. But this is one of the many theoretical reconstructions of the Lighthouse of Alexandria.
and John talked about being in Alexandria, and as was my father. And of course, we don't know what it actually looked like, but what was the lighthouse? Certainly, it was a symbol of the presence of the city to the sea. And that is something that was very much also the case in Sydney with the lighthouse, the Macquarie Lighthouse on South Headland. And imagine the difference, though, because the Mediterranean very much the pool of the known world, whereas this lighthouse erected at the far end of the known world. And it was not only a symbol back to the ocean of the presence of the city, it was also a signal back into Sydney of the presence of arriving ships. It was, in a sense, the internet of its day. And it still has that incredible relationship back to the city through the lights and the flags that communicated with Observatory Hill. So imagine the drama of seeing the lighthouse, the Pharos, either in Alexandria, the biggest of the ancient world, or this tiny simulacra on South Head. And I really want to talk about how these objects were conceived in the Greek world, in particular their relationship to the geography. And I always tell people that if you want to see the best places in Greece, simply go to all the ancient sites, because they are the most memorable of the landscapes of Greece, and in fact of Sicily, and in fact of Turkey, and the like. But they were marked with a symbolic character as well, and there are a number of writers who've talked about this, and this of course is the Temple of Sunion, a temple of Poseidon at Sunion on the corner of Attica, which marked the edge of their territory, and is right up on this promontory at the edge of the peninsula. And it sits very proudly today, a wonderful ruin. But a lot of the 19th century conceptions, and this is a drawing by one of the French Beaux-Arts winners, Victor Louis Louvel in 1855, who drew this temple in a very neoclassical way. That is, it's based on right angles and it's based on an ideal geometry. But that's not how the Greeks necessarily saw it, because they saw it as an object in space related to the movement of the body through the territory. And this is the counter theory or the counter drawing by the Greek architect Constantine Doxiadis, who said that rather than seeing it as this fixed arrangement in right angles, it's about the human body arriving at the porch, the propylaea, and then seeing the temple, seeing the long side of the temple where you would have seen the columns with the wall behind, and then seeing the front of the temple where you would have seen the columns obliquely, where they would have read as a solid. And this is a way of arrival that's very particular to Greek architecture, and in fact Angelo will also talk about this, so I won't steal his talk. And so what you really read are these temples as bodies in space, and this is Doxiadis' fantastic book. Doxiadis, in fact, one of the great theoreticians and makers of the city, planned Islamabad. If Doxiadis' career turned out differently, this talk might have turned out differently as well, because in fact Doxiadis had a short and rather unsuccessful career as a Brisbane tomato grower. And maybe not the highlight of his career, but what a contact that could have been for Greek culture in Australia and an understanding of cities and space. And so you can see very much the architectural landscape, how they're bodies in space, elements in space related to the points in the landscape, which are then given a mythological dialogue as well, creation myths and the like. And you can imagine in terms of the indigenous occupation, there's song lines and the movement through the landscape and the like. That's a talk for another day with more research. But when you look at Sydney, I showed you the photo, the image around 1800. This is straight after Governor Macquarie licet in 1824. And what you'll notice here is the elements of order which Macquarie brings to the town of Sydney. And what he did, like the Greeks, is he actually placed them on the ridges. And so to the eastern side, you'll know he erected the terrace of Macquarie Street, with, you can see the spire of St James, and then the Rum Hospital, which we sit within part of it, down to the first government house, the stables, the fort, and then on the other headland, Dawes Battery, and the hospital, and then the barracks. And so these elements, which are elements of organisation of power, more of control than in the Greek city. But these very much organise the city, not through planning as conventionally understood, but through the force of architecture. Now, it's important to also understand that the territory, and Minister Stokes actually mentioned the Hippodamian grid and Priene, which is just down the road from Miletus, in fact, in modern-day Turkey. And the city of Priene was not a large city, but it's one of the most beautiful Greek plans, because it's sited in relation to this very dramatic hill behind, if you've never been there, and it's on this dome of landscape. And so in Priene, the streets that run on the Hippodamian grid across the contour are relatively flat. The streets that run this way are steep, and you can see all of the civic elements and the religious elements congregated in the middle of the city, the sport on the outside. If you look at the colonial plans, in fact enacted by Sir Thomas Mitchell as Surveyor General of New South Wales, sorry, all these notes are on the bottom for your reference. This is the plan of Coogee, his first plan from 1836. Curiously, you saw in the Greek plan the perimeter wall. At Coogee, and in fact in countless settlements up and down the coast and country towns, all planned on this same grid, which is actually adopted from Indian plans the British rolled out in India. The foreshore is in fact also for defence, but is kept open for defence rather than walled. The central street is on the centre of the bay, and then the grids run up and down the contour. A fabulously named street, Beach Street. Not too many streets actually have a beach in them. But an incredible sighting in both cases, and I think that one of them is on the dome and the other one's in the bowl. So think of these things not in the conventional, fairly poverty-stricken language of planning, but think of them as real plans and the making of space in relation to the territory. There is an interesting question of the antecedents of classical architecture in Sydney, and this is to take a little local example of the global tendency that Alastair's already shown you, and this to me is the best neoclassical building in Australia. It's Darlinghurst Courthouse, is a painting from 1845 by G. Peacock, which shows, again, the courthouse sited on the crown of the hill at what is today Taylor Square. And you're looking back at the buildings you can see in the distance are, in fact, those buildings by Macquarie on the ridge of Macquarie Street. And you can see how it's set in. But you can't imagine this rather crude painting by G. Peacock. You can't imagine this porch without reference to an elevation of a temple by James Stewart, which again Alastair referred to. And here you can see the classical architecture in all its grandeur, strictness and proportion. And just look at the proportion, just a few steps, the Doric order, the entablature, the pediment, replicated in Darlinghurst Courthouse almost exactly, with the wings added, because exactly as Alastair said, adapting it to a contemporary program. The courthouse didn't have this form in ancient Greece. Of course, the pedimental sculpture is a symbol of the British Empire. And that is still there today, but like the proper layer of the Acropolis itself, which was, again, not quite a temple front because it had the wider gap for the way through in the middle. It was meant to be extended laterally, which was never realised due to the conflict with the temple of Athena Nike, and the painted gallery was never completed on the left. But then this remarkable extension, this lateral extension of Darlinghurst Courthouse 50 years later by the successor as New South Wales colonial architect James Barnett in the 1880s, where he took the idea of the only strict Doric building that Barnett erected in sympathy with that of his predecessor Mortimer Lewis. Now again, you may think of the Greek porches here, of course the porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis in fine Pentelic marble. As an architect, to look at the detail, if you look at the corner column, you can't see the pointer, but look in particular at these columns here, and remembering the example of the British Museum. And then a very fine, I think, the best Ionic portico in Sydney is the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney sandstone. And so you see already the sort of localisation, that process that Alastair talked about, the localisation through the indigenous material of the sandstone, but also the difference in the corner capital. And so rather than turning the corner, and the British Museum actually did both, they actually run much more machine-like straight through, and you can see in the Erection they're actually turned, maybe without the fineness of detail in this, but nonetheless I think the most beautiful porch in Sydney. Now you may think it was a direct take, but in fact the Art Gallery of New South Wales' direct antecedent is the Scottish National Gallery, and it was quite explicitly the brief, and so here we find classical architecture actually imported via Enlightenment Edinburgh. You might think that the Stoa of Atlas, reconstructed here in the 1950s in Athens, was the precursor for the buildings on Macquarie Street. But again, you'd be mistaken, because these actually come from Indian norms from the British Empire. This is the original Rum Hospital, now Sydney Hospital buildings, demolished in the 1880s. And in fact, you might not recognise the building that you are in at the moment, but you are actually seated under the fountain. And that is the Parliament of New South Wales. And if you think of the form of the two houses on either side, in contrast to the old and the new Bouleuterion in Athens, and the Bouleuterion was one of the institutions of democracy, with the meeting of the 100, wasn't it, Alastair? And so the old ones on the left and the new ones here. Of course, thinking of Greek architecture and its invention of democracy, you didn't need a room with a council until you had democracy and you wanted debate. And so the rooms, either the horseshoe with the amphitheatre or the U-shape, replicated in their own way in the bear pit upstairs. Or more open egalitarian elements, the Hill of the Pnyx in Athens, where the people used to meet. There was the red rope with the paint to gather the citizens together. A bit defunct these days, but Speaker's Corner in the Domain actually had, just down the road here, had a similar public oratory, open air, democratic, a bit bemoaned. The internet's not quite as good, is it? Or you could think, just if you let's take a walk up and down Macquarie Street, Hadrian's Gate, you can't imagine the former New South Wales Treasury building by the successor government architect W.L. Vernon in late 1890s. You can't imagine this front piece of this building being conceived without the precedent of Hadrian's Gate in Athens. Or in fact, the Greeks loved votive offerings, they loved sculptures, they loved commemorating events, winners and the like, and so the drawings of Delphi, again from the Beaux-Arts drawing, and our minor reflection of that, which is Macquarie Place, the place of the gathering of trophies, and particularly the two by Greenway quoting ancient Egypt, and the other one, the fountain, quoting ancient Greece, and then other monuments gathered together here, a sort of a minor echo of a provincial city in relation to the practices of Greek culture. Of course, there's also popular art, what you might call vernacular classicism, Greek street art in Athens, and actually in Bondi Junction. Who would have thought that, the off-the-shelf classical cement sculptures, and you can see the Venus de Milo there and Apollo up here, and even sort of caryatids, not many caryatids in Sydney, unfortunately. Of course, John has talked about the Lysicrates monument in Athens, replicated in Sydney, made more democratic by not being up on a base, so it's accessible, brought from the garden on Point Piper, at Potts Point. But of course, it's a form that's again replicated, and this is from Calton Hill in Edinburgh. Again, the influence of Greek culture, second-hand imported to Australia. Or in fact, another of the wonders of the ancient world, the tomb of Halicarnassus, the tomb of Mausoleus, the king, which gives us the name mausoleum, replicated in Melbourne with due import, with due gravity, as the Shrine of Remembrance, curiously placed atop Newcastle Town Hall. And a friend sent me this when I was preparing the talk, and I even though I've seen this building hundreds of times, I hadn't noticed the reference. So, there may be hundreds of these references for you to find as well. But again, as Alastair showed, also curiously replicated in the Parliament yet in Tokyo, which maybe is not quite as obvious a translation as the one in Melbourne. And who can not go to the National Library without thinking, as the architect did, that the model is the Parthenon? Except when you read the text. Walter Bunning, the architect's own trip to Greece and the Parthenon was a major influence on the design. Being inspired, the library was designed to replicate the geometric rhythms of the Parthenon, but when finally built had one fewer rows of columns as a result of NCDC cost cutting. How familiar is that? And if you know about the geometry of the Greek temples, that is particularly relevant because most Greek temples had 6 columns in the front and 13 columns, that is double plus 1. The Parthenon had 8, that means 17 in the long facade. By taking off the 1, it gets 8 and 16, which is a double cube, which is not at all Greek geometry. So Philistine cost cutting is alive and well in the southern hemisphere. And then there's some analogues, and this will be a segue with Angelo's talk as well. And I wanted to talk specifically about obviously the Sydney Opera House, Jorn Utzon's masterpiece in relation to the Acropolis. And often Utzon's building is talked about in terms of the influences from China, from Elsinore Castle, even from Mayan architecture. But I think the resonances with the Acropolis to us are very powerful as well. So you can see how it's a set of forms arranged on an artificial base, a constructed topography. So you can see there's the base that Utzon so marvellously organised to contain all the service functions with the shelves above, and you can see the dialogue between the base and the Tarpeian walk. And you can see then in this old photo of the Acropolis, in fact, the earth leaking out of the artificial perimeter. And remember that the Acropolis is in fact a construction as well, and this is the Mycenaean basis of the Acropolis, and you can see the successive walls, still one part of that wall in existence. And then in a sense the Acropolis is actually a constructed topography, as is the Opera House. And of course the Opera House then organises itself very much in a Greek manner, to my eyes, with the 2 amphitheatres, again a Greek form. And to me, I can't help thinking of the great amphitheatre at Pergamum in terms of the ground worked, and of course the gathering of people for culture, which is the invention of the Greek theatre. The base and the movement of the body up the base, again, anyone who's been to the Acropolis, it's quite a walk up the Acropolis, the body in space. And then the space in between, and this is Utzon's original competition drawing where he said it's actually the dialogue between the 2 shells, and he was the only person in the competition to have the 2 shells, the 2 halls side by side on the point. And of course in the Acropolis, the movement up, and these are Doxiadis' perspectives where you're between the temple and you see open sky through the central perspective. And then the construction, where in the Greek temple, in fact, every stone is visible in the construction. You can see only the iron clamps aren't visible, but you can see the order of Greek architecture is incredibly clear. And the same with Utzon. In fact, this order of different elements brought together, not a classical order, but one founded in construction and material character. And the severity, which I could only call a Doric sensibility, which extends, I think, from, or as an analogy from the Parthenon, this is obviously the indented corner, you can see the painted decoration, to the structural order of Utzon's work, the ground plane, the modelling of the ground plane, the exactitude of the elements. Remember that the base of the Acropolis, of the Parthenon, is in fact curved. Remember the entasis, the last column, is pushed in more than the others, the accuracy of Utzon's construction, and even the interest in the line. And so Utzon's sections of the interior of the hall and the various profiles of Doric columns, Doric capitals. And so this sort of resonance, which is very much a visual thing that architects like to talk about. But of course the other great parallel between these buildings, to conclude, is how they are in fact the whole image and character of their city and in fact of their country, and how the Opera House sits in its majestic detachment in the middle of our harbour, an element for all of us to marvel at in exactly the same way that all of Athens, all of Greece, and in fact all of history looks to the Parthenon and the Acropolis. Thank you. I'll just get it ready for Angelo.
Now, I would like also to welcome, we have Minister Stokes here, we have the speaker, O'Day, Jonathan O'Day, and also we have with us Shadow Treasurer, Daniel Muhi, and member of the Legislative Council, Peter Poulos. So thank you for joining us. Now it gives me great pleasure in welcoming the very distinguished architect Angelo Candelepas, who also is the creator of the winning design for the new National Gallery of Victoria Contemporary Gallery in Melbourne. Over to you, Angelo.
I was asked to think about whether I should be last or first, and it's kind of a little unfair to be last because, frankly, everyone said so much before me, but ministers, friends, Consul General, I have to start by saying that Greeks are indigenous in their land and found it important to make that representation in 1821. And in so being, we find it important to acknowledge the indigenous people of this land before every time we speak, remembering that all people at some point are indigenous. I've had a very interesting time in considering what, if anything, actually, has been the influence of Greece upon architecture of this country. And most recently I was emailed a document by Philip Thalis, so actually Philip Thalis has orchestrated all of this. And that document included an appraisal of the rebuilding of Athens in the style of a noble city. So the Athenians wanted to build Athens as Athens in the 1830s. And they were relying, because it was a very poor country, upon the wealth from those that had travelled abroad. At that time, you were Athenian or you were Delian, but you were Hellenic. This was the time when many great cities had chosen, as previous speakers had said, that architecture from ancient Greece to adorn their countries. And it was possibly because earlier everyone was moving into this Enlightenment world, where in fact after 1,000 years or so of people considering democracy as a bad thing, they suddenly considered democracy as a good thing. I notice that ministers are coming in and out, possibly to vote, and they wouldn't even know what that meant if it wasn't for the ancient Greeks to vote for something in a democracy. What's interesting is that there are favourite buildings of mine. In Athens, I want to talk about Athens. And then I researched actually why I liked this building so much. It was a building called the Numismatic Museum, which is a very interesting building. It was actually a house by a very, very wealthy, bad archaeologist. Terrible archaeologist. He was so bad, he was banned from being in Turkey because he said he discovered Troy and he hadn't. His name was Schliemann, and in fact he was told by the Turkish government, you must leave here because we've had enough of this rubbish, and he'd ruined all of the ISIS pales into insignificance. But he and his wife, they were not allowed to do anything, but they went to Mycenae, and then he declared, again wrongly, that he had found the tomb of Agamemnon. Poor man, he'd kind of found this beautiful thing and he thought, oh, this is what I found. What was interesting is that legacy was not so much about archaeology in the end, but about the interest in looking for things in archaeology. And he perhaps arguably is the beginning of the end of that, because by the end of, let's say, the Egyptian find at Tutankhamun, that was people that had enough of the rape and pillage. But the mood in the New World was about creating cities. And they needed to create cities because the world was becoming industrialised, and they needed to find something to anchor themselves to. Vienna was built in Paris between 1853 and 1870, Barcelona 1856, and in fact, when you think about it, Sydney was declared a city in 1842, and Melbourne only 5 years after its inception in 1847. This was a period where people were building cities. Sadly, Hippodamius wasn't the precedent for Sydney. We don't have this wonderful grid that Melbourne has, and Doxiadis wasn't around. But at that time, there was no fear of the past. And there was great inspiration to be gained by looking at the past. And by 1919, it was again an unfashionable thing. And that's why perhaps T.S. Eliot, one of the great poets, wrote this concept about antiquity, about looking constantly to the past. He wrote in 1919 in this wonderful essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison amongst the dead. For me, Eliot represented a full circle picture of our place in the world. I don't really have a long list of buildings that can be related to the Greek world, but on reflection, I have a short list of my favourite buildings. None of them actually are terribly contemporary. I have 3. And I'm going to explain to you the 3 and why I like them, but then it occurred to me when I was gaining permission from Richard Johnson to talk about his Greek ideas. He is the person who collaborated with Utzon in putting together something about the Opera House to protect the interests of its architecture. He collaborated on the work of Governor Philip Tower, and he also created an extension to one of my favourite buildings. And I hadn't realised why I loved him so much, and now I do, because he's linked with those 3 buildings. And the 3rd building is the one in Martin Place, which is, in fact, very Greek, and in fact, I studied extensively. So these are the traits of the buildings I like, and then I realise actually they have to do something with a Greek ethic, and then I realise of course they do. I have Greek heritage. I, of course, am always been told by my parents we are Doric, never Ionian. What is that? We are Doric. We are the Dorian race. We are part of the Orchomenos, which is this beautiful place where Schliemann went, and he didn't take too much from. But these are the traits. Firstly, the buildings I like deliver a sense of civic worth. They seek to remind us that we belong to something great and can make this representation in the architecture. That architecture removes any doubt about the fallacy of the human condition if indeed it represents certain eternal and universal values. Architecture can remove doubt that our lives are not worthwhile. Secondly, they understand scale and approach. How do you come to the building? And what is that about? It's about the human approach to buildings. They deliver a sculptural understanding of the object which is being observed by the eye at human level. The 10-part analysis that Philip talked about is interesting, doxiadis. And what we forget is there has been an enormous amount of intellectual, poetic, artistic, musical enterprise out of Greece in the past 100 years. And doxiadis is incredible. But Xenakis, who worked with Corbusier and others, would understand these concepts of the power of architecture. Moving to watch the building as an observer is critical to the success. And what do you need for that? You need to imagine doing it yourself as an architect, and imagine how others' bodies would behave in those sequence of movements, looking at buildings and how you excite certain things in the human condition. Thirdly, they are all buildings that have a geometric basis, a universal idea about mathematics, and they subscribe to the concept of finding beauty from nature and understanding that geometry and numbers are part of nature. They are reliant on Pythagoras and trigonometry. Great buildings must understand Pythagoras. They are also reliant on Euclid. They are also reliant on Plato and his ideas of solids. They bypass Descartes historically. They even bypass Einstein and go straight to the source of geometry and these universal values of mathematics that are understood by everybody, from a child to the most intellectual person. Oh, is it double-sided? Fourthly, they are inventive through a tradition of values that are not of their own time. They take the past to deliver something extraordinary. The Parthenon was not of its own time. It was as a consequence of 500 years of the development of the ancient temple. Fifthly, they provide decoration in a manner which is intrinsic to the structure of the forms, enabling a memory of the structure. And the purpose of the work is embedded in this relationship between structure and decoration, to give a balanced joy to the eye of the observer. It's not just a mathematic understanding which is one-dimensional. It offers delight. Delight. Sixthly, architecture is rendered with form and space, and that there is a fundamentally sculptural quality to any great work. This is why the great buildings are intended to be seen in space in a critical way, emerging from the landscape. Lastly, this speaks to Philip, they're expensive. They're not cheap buildings. None of them were cheap. None of them were a race to the bottom to find the cheapest outcome for the cheapest result, to have no legacy, to have no idea. No expense was spared. Why? It's the most sustainable outcome to have a building that people love. It's very unsustainable to have a 20-year building and then want to demolish it because its fad has gone. It's the worst thing that we as a society are doing, creating these incredible wastelands of rubbish. But what's important to remember when someone reflects what Pericles was saying about, I will not spare a cent to demonstrate the worth of my civilization because we're worth something. I will not spare a cent. When people reflect on what was Pericles famous for, I looked it up to see what Wikipedia said. And it was for his funeral oration. Take care. We look at the buildings, but he's most famous for his speech. And what does that say? Here they are, my 3 favourite buildings. They're not here yet because that's the Parthenon. But I'll tell you what they are before I start. The Sydney Opera House. It's interesting that architecture students don't learn about it. I've often taught final year and they say they've never been to it. But education is another topic, just like your other topics. First government bank by the Sydney architects and engineers, Ross and Rowe. And they needed to be engineers because actually the whole building is like the Parthenon, it's a structure. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And Governor Philip Tower. What a building. What I want to talk about is a little bit about the 10-part movement of Doxiadis, a little bit more about what he observed. Now, people have said this is wrong. You know, people that say this is wrong. If you're in a university, you know that there's always some other idea. Doesn't matter if it's a bad one, it's another one, and so that becomes what they call valid. Do you know what I mean? But Doxiadis wrote this and demonstrated it on dozens of temples. And so, for me, it's important. And I can have arguments till I'm blue in the face with very, very smart people who say very, very unsmart things. But when you look at how the spaces between buildings have been cast in this beautiful drawing of Doxiadis, you can start to imagine walking like wading through water. Fluid is air, and air is fluid. It is a bit like wading through water, going through space. And when I was asked recently what I felt most beautiful about the architecture of the National Gallery of Australia, I said I imagined it filled with water and swimming around into the spaces, because air is fluid. And if you imagine it as thick, you imagine it as connecting you to the matter around you. And that's why buildings become very important, because buildings are connected to us through the air. And imagine you're walking in the air and you're connected to these beautiful buildings and you want to cry at the Parthenon. Who has had that sense? Why? I don't know. But it's talking to you. And it's not because we're Greek. Then there was an idea about beauty. What on earth was this thing called beauty? And we don't have, in Greek, if you know the language, we don't have a thing to describe evil. There's no word for evil. Even in the Lord's Prayer, it's alaris apotuponiru. It's not evil. It's the translation is poor. What we want is kalos, which is good, and that's not beautiful. Kalos is another word. It's not beautiful. It's good. And what they wanted was good work. And they prized good work because it had relationships with geometry and mathematics that to the eye was perfect. We, in the Western world, come to this concept that we can't seek perfection. Why not? Why not? And then there were these other ideas about the geometry that dealt with things that I think this is wrong. Look at the decoration of the triglyphs. What is this? This is the Doric temple. This is the Parthenon. They are elements of the timber in the old temples replicated in marble that come out and have spaces. And what they do is painted colours. And it's about structure and about arresting the eye and giving delight. The Western world made these temples all white marble, but they were never white marble. Look at how much shadow and shade, and look how much detail, even when it's stripped of its marbles. Look at how much delight people, and they looked at themselves up there, you know. They looked at themselves, the great panegyric, the great things that they were doing in the day were sculpted up there. They were the mirror of society. It was about society. And even Athena inside was not actually doing anything but serving. The Queen of England died, and she was trying to be like a god, serving the people, like an ancient god, not ruling. But look more importantly how the absence of form is delivered. Suddenly, this development is so beautiful because they sculpted with a tool, sculpted, so there's no... I'll show you something. It disappears. It disappears. There's no form. Why? To give the illusion of hovering delight to the eye. Now, if I'm going to do something to influence something somewhere, I'm taking that idea very seriously in my work. Now, the Opera House, isn't it interesting how he built the Acropolis? He built it. And he built it very consciously with amphitheatres and wanted to see it like this. Why? Because there's something primordial about it. There's something that connects us to the universe. The thing about being Greek is it's about being human and understanding that we're nothing and that everything else matters. And finding what it is that matters. Finding it. And looking at things that make you want to get weak at the knees. Look at this wonderful... I was talking to a completely mad person at the bottom of the Parthenon because I was following a cat one day. You know what? I don't know why I was doing that. And then I stumbled upon this crazy person, and I didn't recognise him first because most people there are crazy. And then he said, there's a person, underneath is the original temple. Underneath all of that is the original temple. And then I fantasised, wouldn't it be wonderful if they demolished the top and put anyway. But isn't it interesting when you see it in the way that architects see it? And architects see history differently to people other than architects. We don't see it as a continuum. Edith Hall is interesting. She's an historic. I find it really boring to be an historian in a sense without being rude because we see history as though it's today. So I see the Parthenon as though it was built today because how exciting it would be to build something like that for the first time. Goodness me. But look at how amazing it is in its landscape. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And what is that? It's not about the coins, or in the Greek Orthodox Church they put the Opera House and the Parthenon, you know, in the symbols. It's not about that. It's that it represents the whole of humanity. It doesn't represent its place. The Opera House doesn't represent Sydney. How can it? It represents our relationship to the earth. And it does it through geometry, it does it through architecture. And look at what you can do if you're just doing a very simple Doxiades examination. You can find that suddenly at one point, as you're walking, it is unveiled to you. You know when you're walking up at the Parthenon, you see it from a distance always, and then you get to a point and it gets unveiled to you, right? The same happens at the Opera House. You always have an image of it from places, and then suddenly there is the controlled proposition of movement toward it. And that is something that Utzon was aware of, as he was aware of the other view, which is in our subconscious always, but we never see it all the time, the ferry ride in, to see the building. And it's a geometric form. Look how simple it is. It's two lines. It has optimism, like the Parthenon, optimistic. It doesn't go inward to the city, doesn't face the city, it faces out, like the Parthenon. It is looking to the horizon, to the future, to optimism. And look at the geometry of it. It's so simple. And imagine walking up the centre, and imagine if he got to build what he could build, but wasn't allowed. Just imagine you would be able to see through the two sails. There's always someone in a meeting room that says the wrong thing, you know, and you feel like throwing yourself over the top of the table to strangle them. But this is what we learn from the English. We say, oh, that's all you do. And I'm sure there were many occasions where poor Utzon had that feeling, you know, that feeling where you want to throw yourself across the table. I do it often, that thought, not throw myself. This Sydney Opera House, this was one of my favourite architects in the world. Raphael Moneo drew this. Isn't it interesting? The legacy of great architecture brings another culture. Culture is to do with cultivating. It's actually, in Greek, it's beautiful as a word because it means kalirgo. Kalos, which was good, ergo, which is work. Kalirgo. Can't translate it. This is about the circles. Now, what's interesting is without Pythagoras, you couldn't have built this building. And in the long conversation I had with Richard Johnson, he had to admit that. He said, Jon Utzon never talked about Greeks. And I said, but he should have. Because when you have Pythagoras, you can do the building. When you don't have Pythagoras, what was he going to do without pi? There were no computers. He couldn't do a thing, you know, which you do now. You draw the circle without knowing anything about algebra or mathematics. But look at the decoration on this building. It's both part of its structure, part of its making, it's exactly like the Parthenon, and part of its just delight, for no reason other than an understanding of how the eye plays on colour, on madness. Knowing how the eye plays is the work of an architect. You can't ignore it. It's our poetry. Look, goodness me, if you said, I'm going to do a shell made of concrete and put zigzags on the top of it in ceramic tiles, they think you're mad, but look how beautiful it is. And it actually doesn't ever look exactly like that. And it comes from a sphere, again. One of my favourite buildings is this building. I'll go through quickly. It's in Martin Place. It is very Greek. Poor things. They couldn't get away from it. They went into the same ideas of the Parthenon, which is to create the square root of 2 in a 1-1 triangle. It's the golden mean. And in fact, the most interesting thing about this building is that it copies as precisely as any other building in the world the ancient orders, the acroteria at the top of the Acropolis. I drew this when I was in university. I was quite young and I can't even see now, but I drew all these things and studied all these things. This was my thesis at university. And I went around all the temples, which was just maddening, and I discovered where they got them from. And I've got them all down there. And you know, the professor at university, they always say, you can't ever say it as fact. You know, that's, you know what I mean? Professor said, you can't say it as fact. And I said, it is a fact. That's where it's from. Look. And I copied all of the things that are from the different temples, top and bottom, and they were right. But anyway, I got what they call a credit for this because I had that, you know, a credit. It's like a fail, really. You know, the marks, They're so cruel, aren't they, to students? You would have got an HD, he said, but you said that. Anyway, what's nice about it is I was right and he was wrong. And I give him his mark back, he can have the credit. What's really beautiful about this building is that the formwork is ceramic tile. Oh my God, imagine that. Ceramic tile with links at the back, and then they poured the concrete, and that's it. So it's the structure. Someone very famous, whose name I can't remember, said, architecture, I think it was Neville Grossman, but he bad, because he said that to me, and I thought this was the one good thing. Architecture finished with the Greeks, because the truth of form coming from structure, coming from a single material, was never done again the same way. And then you see the Opera House yearns for this form and structure. Isn't it beautiful? Like, we are structures ourselves. We have bone and we can see it, but there's decoration and there's things around us that make us human. The buildings can have this human quality too. Anyway, I did a lot of work. Oh, this is my last building. I love this building. It has a bottom, it's like a column. I would say it's like a Doric column. Someone would say it's more like Ionic, but you know, the proportion for me is Doric. All based on the golden mean and proportions from ancient Greece. And if he was here, he would attest to it. Richard Johnson has confirmed that to me. And I said to him, am I allowed to say it? He said, you most certainly are. Look at this one. Goodness. It's perfect. I do sketches, and I hadn't realised quite how many sketches of the buildings that I love. And I forgot to put the art gallery, and I stopped loving that a while back, because there's so many interventions, you know. This is the Parthenon, what I see in the setting sun. This is the Parthenon. I think I might have 550 sketches of the Parthenon. But isn't it nice not to have a picture of it at some point? This is the Opera House. This is my idea of the processional route up to the Opera House. And I feel like there's an equivalence to the movement up to the Parthenon when I see that sketch. Thank you very much. Oh, there's one more thing. This, Odenos isos theoteronti que apathes estin. And I know that Alastair gave me a nice version of this, but it didn't have the proper toni on it. And you know, I'm really a stickler for that. The siempre spomeni has to be right. So I don't know.
Alastair, do you want to tell us what this means?
Yes. So the mind. Yes, the mind is perhaps a kind of divine and feeling thing.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, we can have a couple of questions and answers. Can I? Well, I think there is a mic here. So if you want to ask a question, are there any questions? Please.
Well, I want to thank the speakers for a very beautiful and interesting and informative talk. We've heard a bit about Miletus, and we've heard a bit about Hippodamus. One of the things that wasn't mentioned about him was his idea of a perfect city and a perfect size of a city, which I think is very important in this day of population increase and oversized cities. And what he said was that the perfect size of a city was one with 10,000 people, where all the citizens could recognise all the other citizens by sight, which is a very good idea, human concept. We're way beyond that, where the size of a city is determined by global commerce, finance,
Alastair, do you want to?
I mean, it's possibly worthwhile. I mean, a couple of things. First of all, I think when he says 10,000, he's meaning men. So you would then multiply it up by 20. So we give you a city of about 25,000, right?
And slaves?
And plus slaves, yes. But you know, it's I mean, it's not that the ancient world didn't think about big cities, right? You know, Rome, you know, is 1 million people at its height, you know, and is the largest city up until Victorian London, right? There is nothing like Rome up until then. So it's not like the ancient world wasn't thinking about it, and it's about how you establish communities within small groups that allows that kind of enormous thing to be kind of manageable and in bite-sized pieces, so that, you know, that in a sense, you know, it is about kind of how you embed the local within a kind of grander cosmopolis. And I think that's the challenge that the ancient world faced, but actually managed to meet.
I think Alastair's cosmopolitan is a great word. And what does cosmopolitan mean? 2 Greek words, come on, John. World and city, world city. So it means, and if you look at, in fact, Miletus in ancient times, and if you look at Ephesus and, of course, Alexandria, they were incredibly cosmopolitan cities. And interesting, the figure of 10,000, of course, that's also the figure of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, which is a suburban idea or a satellite idea. But I think the cosmopolitan nature of Sydney and, in fact, contemporary cities is a real positive. I'm no fan of megacities per se. I'd love a cosmopolitan Newcastle or a cosmopolitan Coffs Harbour. So I think but the cosmopolitan character of ancient cities and their openness to the known world was one of their characteristics. Of course, Athens, that was absolutely at the heart of Athens in the Golden Age.
Thank you. Angelo, do you have anything to add?
I just want to add one thing. Most cities have failed. Miletus failed. All the cities at some point fail. And the consequence of, let's say, just a discussion which is epistemological is that it will fail. I mean, London failed. At some point they had a terrible period. Paris is the only one, I have to say, where it hasn't failed. In fact, it's possibly the most densely populated city in the world. And the question I have, therefore, is, what are we doing to understand the technology of our time? Because Miletus and Hippodemos was talking in the context of that technology. What are we doing to understand how we are able to, let's say, have communion, not community, just communion in the city? And everything in the New World wasn't geared toward as much an understanding of public space as it was in the more ancient world, because it didn't need to do so. We didn't need piazzas because we didn't have too many people to hang. But I think if you just reflect on the concept that most cities have failed, then there is a task to be had about what to do now. And very few people are thinking about that.
There is one other very key dimension of Miletus and, in fact, Priene that I showed, and Ephesus, is that they're all victims of climate change. And so what happened in all those cities is, in fact, that the land rose, the sea receded, their harbours became swamps, Ephesus, as in Ostia, in fact, in Rome. And so, in fact, they were abandoned because of climate change. That's an incredibly relevant thing to think about in the 21st century. And it's actually one of the problems with cities being fixed points of geography in a world which will change around them.
If you just reflect the difference between London and Paris, in London, people sought to live outside the city as a prestigious place because the city was just disgusting to live in. It was a sewer. In Paris, it was prestigious to live in the city. So in London, you would catch a train out and work in the city. In Paris, it would be more prestigious to be part of the city. But there's another question here. Thank you, Ed.
I'm sorry, before we move
Yeah.
to the other question, Alastair, do you want to add
No,
anything?
no.
No? I'm sorry? Yes.
Angelo,
Oh.
in your points about the buildings that we love, which one of them is that they're expensive.
Oh, no, she's a client.
And she went on to say, spare no expense. I know from what you've told me that you get up every day to design the very best you can. But the world you live in isn't a perfect world, and it isn't one created for you to design to the standards that you would like to, and I'm sure there are many architects who share that. Can you just talk to that a bit about how you do manage to keep yourself driven and inspired?
I don't think that's a very good question for a client to ask. I mean, you know, look, the thing about it is that these buildings had a public interface, which was more about what the city was making than developments. And one of the things that perhaps is an error in people's mind is that every single thing needs to be incredibly, let's say, iconic. That's not true. The good things, the good cities have an undercurrent of really good work, but it has to meet a standard. And that standard is able to be, as you know, balanced out and prioritised out. My view is that the public is the priority. And what we should be doing is looking at what, and you know this because we've talked about in our project up there at Manly, this idea of the largesse that architecture can have in the city. So most buildings are not an opera house. Imagine what a terrible place it would be if on every corner someone built an opera house and then there was no expense bed. Well, I can't actually. That's hell for me. But I think what is important is to recognise that your project needs to have modesty so that it can be good for everyone. And that modesty is the generosity back to the next door neighbour or the other person that is not going to be visually interrogated by something too interesting. And then there are opportunities where great architecture needs to happen, and Pericles or the Premier of a state can decide these things, and they should be allowed to emerge without the criticism of them being regarded as expensive. That's what I was trying to say.
May I just
Please.
No.
Please.
I feel clients don't do the best by the outcomes we can get by, if from the presentation tonight from the three of you, thank you so much, if clients knew and thought more about this before they gave the briefs to architects, we might get more buildings that in fact privately, if they're private, could be of great civic worth, could be more humble, could be more beautiful, could be expensive, but still, you know, we have this responsibility to build for the greater good, don't we? Not just our own private, but we're building for. And I take very much thank you that more people who brief you should be informed.
Yeah.
If we could.
I mean, the other thing I would add is that clients shouldn't be in such a rush. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the ancient world is the time scale in which buildings are built. So in a sense, it doesn't matter about if you've had a bad year for the crops, because in a sense, economic conditions are poor, then you have less available labour, your building takes longer. So in a sense, the idea that you're having to build quite quickly is the problem.
I don't believe that. I think in the ancient world they were rushing them through. I mean, Pericles was rushing that Parthenon out. I mean, and Justinian built the whole of Hagia Sophia in 5 years, and he was rushing it out. And they had the same imperatives to demonstrate, as we do, their worth. And let's say, if I go back to my world at my desk, there are interest rates. There are people that suffer, and those sort of things get in the way. You've got a bank loan, and they get in the way. But overarching, I'd like to say that our practice at Leaks works with the most wonderful people that understand the dividend that comes with good work. And there's so many people that don't. And you can try to educate people, but sometimes it's not as easy as just putting them in an audience to have a discussion and then suddenly they say, oh yes, you're right. I haven't had that experience. But I have had the experience where there's some beautiful people in the world creating beautiful work, listening to what are the priorities. And some of you are here. And I have to say, it's been a privilege to work with those people because they do understand these values. It's not for everyone, though.
All right. And the last question? Yes, please, Jane. And yes, another question. Yeah. So please, Jane. Yes. Who are you asking?
I wanted to know their opinions, doesn't matter who answers, on their thoughts on Parliament House in Canberra and the successes Canberra as a modern city.
Oh no.
No, Philip, you will answer that, yes. And there will be only one person answering, and that's you.
Well, as it happens, we do a lot of work in Canberra, know Canberra very well. And I think the Griffins really produced the greatest plan of the 20th century city. And I think that the problems with Canberra is that it hasn't been followed through. I'm not a great fan of Parliament House, in that, in contradistinction to what Angelo and I were saying about the Opera House or the Parthenon, where in fact everything is much more Roman, or in fact Byzantine, in the sense that everything is effacing. There's nothing that's integral in the making of it, is it from an architectural point of view. I also do find it's not the same open idea of democracy as, say, the Hill of Lipnicks. It's, submerged chambers. I find that difficult with the sort of myth of the grass roof, which is now fenced. So, without giving an essay on this topic,
thank
between
you.
those.
Thank you, Philip. Patricia, there was a question? Yes? Yes, please.
Can I be provocative here?
Beg your pardon?
Talking Sydney,
Yeah.
and beauty of architecture in Greece. This morning there was a pretty provocative comment by Paul Keating in the paper that I think most people might have seen, talking about enlightenment and romanticism. I was interested, I know probably what Joel's perspective is, but I was interested in having the views of Angelo and Alastair in terms of, is there anything we can do to save Barangaroo?
To save Barangaroo. All right. Now, I think this is a topic for another forum. Yes, it is, but we only have 2 minutes before we finish our discussion tonight.
Do you want to say something
And
about
I would. So, will you take it on notice, Alastair, Philip, and Angelo?
Can I just say that's a polite way of saying it's a problematic discussion.
No, it is not a problematic.
For us it is.
Yes,
Yeah, for us it is. Well, and thank you. Yeah.
So, may I, on behalf of all of us, thank our speakers tonight. Thanks to the Minister, we heard about the Hippodamian grid and its influence on Richmond in New South Wales and on Sydney, and then we moved on to Palmyra, the Dilettanti Club, Stuart and Revett, the ideas in the 18th century of the Greek revival being democratic, cosmopolitan, Then we moved on to Praini in Ionia, and my family is Ionian too. Then we, yes. So we moved to the Temple of Poseidon and how with the Pharos of Alexandria and Greenwood's Lighthouse. Then we moved on to the Voulefterion, both in Athens and here where we are. And then finally we talked about valid ideas in universities and university credits and the importance of form and space and how buildings should be built with quality in mind because it's the legacy that they leave behind, and form and space. And I thought that of what Angelo said, the most interesting comments coming from an architect is that Pericles' legacy and what he's most known for is not the Acropolis, but his funerary oration, which takes us to the importance of scribblers and people, the creatives. So it has been a wonderful, thought-provoking gathering, and we owe a lot to our three distinguished speakers, and I would like to thank them on behalf of the Executive Board of Greek business leaders for taking the time and talking to us. And the final point that I would like to say is I forgot to mention that another distinguished member of the Lysikrates Foundation, Professor Thiel, is here with us, and I would like to thank him for attending. So, dear friends, thank you for attending, and please join me in thanking our